My question is to the Prime Minister. In the Prime Minister's press conference yesterday, in response to a question about the scope of the Voice's powers, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "The Voice is not about defence policy, it's not about foreign affairs policy." Prime Minister, what other matters are excluded from the remit of the Voice?
Order. Members on my right and left, the Minister for Home Affairs. Member for Barara was heard in silence, and so will the Prime Minister be heard in silence. Here's the call.
Well, a learned colleague once wrote about what the Voice was about, and he said this. He, Noel Pearson, proposes a consultative body that merely provides advice. It cannot veto Parliament, but rather it provides greater input into the policy-making process, which should lead to policy improvements and greater buy-in from Indigenous people across Australia. It is important that if the Parliament is going to make laws about Indigenous people should be consulted about those laws. There is nothing incongruent about articulation of that rule in the Constitution. The Constitution is where rules for Parliament are set out. In my view, the proposal for an advisory body has real merit and sits most comfortably with the nature of the Constitution. It is the kind of machinery clause that Griffith, Barton and their colleagues might have drafted had they turned their minds to it. It was indeed very wise words from the member for Barara in 2016, uphold and recognise. The member for Barara knows.
Order. The members on my left cannot continue to shout while the Prime Minister is speaking.
And Mr Speaker, why members of the Coalition are shouting while I'm quoting the Shadow Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs and the Shadow Attorney-General is just extraordinary.
The Prime Minister will pause. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting. Members on my right will cease interjecting. The member for Lyons. Members on my right. The member for Bennelong. The manager. Well, I can't hear. Someone's trying to raise a point of order. I can't hear because the Leader of the Opposition is interjecting. I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, on a number of previous occasions you've directed the Prime Minister back to the terms of the question, very specific question, what other matters are excluded from the remit of the Voice? A question asked by somebody who has demonstrated his good faith.
Resume your seat. Member for Hunter. I'll hear from the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, on points of order from the Manager of Opposition Business, consistently he is pulling a section of a question and pretending in the point of order that it was a whole question. It wasn't. And even if it was only that section, the Prime Minister is being relevant to the scope of the Voice.
The Prime Minister is referring to advice and information regarding the Voice, which the question included. So I want to be clear on this. You may not like the part of the question that the Prime Minister is answering, but as long as it is relevant to the broad question, he is able to answer that way. So the Prime Minister has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And the reason why it is relevant to put into context the development of the proposal to do two things: to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our Constitution, and secondly, to consult them, is that this isn't something that has come from nowhere. This is something that has been around for a considerable period of time and been the subject of considerable discourse, including from legal minds, including the Shadow Attorney-General. And indeed, in the report of the Joint Select Committee, the Joint Select Committee tabled in this Parliament.
Cease interjecting.
Seriously.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition, if continues this, will be warned. You cannot continue just to interject constantly. I can't be clearer than that. Same with the member for Greenbury's on a warning. If he says one more thing, he'll leave the chamber. The Prime Minister has the call and will be heard in silence for the remainder of his time.
There have been reports to this parliament, and indeed the member opposite said this on the speech of the tabling of the Joint Select Committee report in 2018, and I agree with him here. The Voice will provide a mechanism for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to be consulted and engaged on the policies and laws that affect them. Has its goals better social and economic policy outcomes for our First Nations people. I find it astonishing that there's interjections during an answer such as this. The fact is that this has been that is the answer.